So folks, Katina Michael coming to you live from Kiama. This is Surf Beach, and you can see a lot of people outside today enjoying the outdoors. It's probably around 30 degrees Celsius, which is pretty warm, but still you're enjoying the sun on your back. Not that burning heat that you get in Arizona, of course. So we're at the point in week 2 where we're trying to identify the stakeholders. We've got it down pat. We think we know what the project is. You've checked with me on scope. You've checked on which virtual team you're participating in, whether it's within ASU and your student cohort is with me, perhaps, or it's with an existing organization you've got some ties with. And Colby, this is for you, right? The ocean. Because there's lots of fish in the ocean and we hate plastic in the ocean. And I thought I'd dedicate this. I have slides, which I'll do in a separate video, but Colby, this one's for you. And so, who are the stakeholders? Do we know who they are? You know, most of us are tied to specific projects when we are working for NGOs, or we're working in a voluntary capacity for a community group. But knowing who the stakeholders are is very important. And so I want you to think about stakeholders that are direct, operational stakeholders, and those that are indirect. And users, of course, because the whole idea for co-design is that users become your main way of eliciting needs. That's how you do the needs assessment. You talk to users. But you also talk to other stakeholders, of course, whether they're people who are influencing government policy, particular agencies that are responsible, for example, for oceans, maybe the maritime groups, a lot of different types of agencies at the government, federal level, or even state, local level. And so what I want you to think about is, who are you going to interview? You need to have one key informant, and if you're doing a solo project that is with your organization, it's got to be the right person to be able to answer your questions pertaining to a challenge. So a lot of people think, oh, you do an interview and you collect data from the interview and then you process it. No. You've got to spend a substantial amount of time preparing for your interview. The interview has got to come from the literature. You've got to know what's going on. You've got to know who the key stakeholders are, what their power plays are, what they're trying to achieve, what their imperatives are, their motives, their drivers. And you ask questions that haven't been answered in the literature already, because what's the point of doing an interview if you're not going to elicit new material, new sources of information, new evidence direct from the stakeholder? And so I want you to think about, who is this person? Is it somebody from a non-government organization? Is it from a not-for-profit? Is it from a corporation? And they're sometimes hard to get. Is it from a government agency? Is it a politician? Is it somebody from citizen science? Is it a community group member? Is it a friend? Is it a young person? Now, the thing with interviewing, so long as you're doing interviews within a course context, you don't have to seek IRB approval. That's the general rule of thumb. But if you're going to publish your research, maybe you're going to show footage from the interview, you need to seek consent. And I would seek consent anyway. I've provided in the lecture notes an example of what a consent would look like, but I want you to look at human subject research on ASU's IRB platform, and I've provided links both in the syllabus and also in the lecture material of how you do that. I want you to CITI training. CITI is spelled CITI. It's a specialist group that sort of focuses on large service delivery, like ethics, right, and IRB approvals and so forth. And so it takes about 4 hours to go through the human research ethics. I think it's about 4 hours. Last time I did it here in America, although I'm in Australia right now and I've sat it in Australia as well. But you periodically go through a refresher every 3 or so years to ensure that you know the latest principles. So an internal review board application, apart from the CITI training, is required for you to actually garner first-hand interview data and publish on that material. People who aren't protected by the university, especially if there's liability in any case. You know, someone says, oh, you caused them harm, or you asked improper questions, or if it was an in-person interview, you did something wrong. And so the IRB process helps you to learn about all of these stages. But I want you to think stakeholder collaboration. Who are your stakeholders? And what is the project? And what are you trying to really get out here and get at? And so when you're going through the literature, whether it's media or news online, sifting through that which is fake, of course, and that which is not real and fabricated, or weaker sources of evidence, as we call them, versus stronger sources of evidence, it would be great if you could find peer-reviewed literature that you could look at and say, well, there's a very strong peer-reviewed paper, maybe in your case, Colby in oceans research, or environmental science research, which is a high impact factor journal in the environmental space. So how do you know if it's high impact? Usually there's an impact factor that's published. So anything over 2 is generally considered really strong. Anything over 1 is moderate, but still has a rigorous peer review process. Anything under 1 is a good journal, but maybe not so many, in terms of readership and number of downloads of individual articles. And so in Mural, you're going to find a document, a framework, which allows you to, look at stakeholder collaborations. And maybe you want to print that out and you want to write on it with a pen if you want, download it as a PDF, and off you go. You can just submit to me in the discussion board perhaps an attachment. Or you can actually learn to use the Mural software inside the platform. Now I'm going to warn you, it does take a bit of fiddling. You are going to take a little bit of time to get used to it, and it can be a time waster. What I'd like you probably to do is, before you even touch the tool, is to brainstorm on a piece of paper and have that as a backup in case you run out of time. But as I was saying to all of you who've turned up to office hours, I don't want you so much to be stressed about frameworks. I want you more to be concerned about your project and how you're going to raise awareness about your project and what your project aims are. And so with interviews, let's say you have 3 research aims, 3 project aims. Well, you may have about 10 questions in the interviews, or 14 questions at most in an hour. And you may separate those questions as linking back to the research aims. Otherwise, what's the point, right? Why are you asking these questions in the first place? And you'd start by asking some perhaps demographic, easy questions, icebreaker questions. You may say, what type of work are you in? You may ask for some form of identification. I don't mean on paper or on a card. I mean rather a name and what they find as an acceptable name to use. It doesn't have to be their real name. A pseudonym is okay. Often that's in the eyes of the researcher to put numbered items, participant 1, participant 2, or to call Greg John, and so forth. And then as you get through the questions, they begin very simple, open-ended, and then perhaps towards 3/4 of the way through, when you've broken the ice, you may ask some more controversial questions. And by controversial, I certainly don't mean causing harm to the individual or putting anyone at risk, including yourself. I mean rather things that might get to that particular nitty-gritty question that you're wanting to ask. So then we record the interview. We tell the participant, is it okay if I switch on my recording device? Say you'll share the transcript with them and they'll have time to amend the transcript. If they want to pull out at any time, they're welcome to pull out at any time. Even as they're going through, you might be asking questions like, is it okay to proceed? And these questions have more to do with, are you not even scratching the surface and you're only half an hour into the interview? And so that becomes a problem. And what you've got to do is say to yourself, all right, keep time. By question 3, I should be up to maybe, the worst case scenario, the 15-minute mark. By question 6, I should be up to the half an hour mark, and just have these guideposts. But as well, once you've got your list of questions, you've got a protocol. You might want to define the special words in each of the questions. You might want to have probes. For example, if the person says yes and they elaborate, what maybe might they talk about next? Then you can anticipate and sort of prod or probe. And if you're feeling like the individual hasn't really said what you wanted to say, or there's something that you accidentally cut them off on, or something like that, just reiterate it. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that topic, and then move on. I would say certainly practice before you actually do the live interview with somebody at home, and act like it's a real scenario and go through it properly. And even through your head, in your head, do the thought experiment and say, oh, we're at this point, what might they ask next? Especially if you're dealing with controversial areas. And I think most of us are in this course. I deal with privacy a lot. In systems, I deal with terms and conditions in digital services for youth. I deal with all sorts of things, faulty implantable devices and manufacturers' liability. So there's a lot of things I talk about, which is not everyone's cup of tea. But if they've agreed to do the interview and I've told them straight up, this is what the interview is going to entail, and that they can leave at any time, and that they will get a chance to follow up on their actual interview data, then things tend to be okay. What else can I tell you? Co-design does focus on the user, so it would be great, for some of you studying the animals like whales, you can't really ask the user, right? The whales don't speak, but I wish they did. They speak in other ways, of course, but who would you ask? Who is the user? Sometimes we anthropomorphize animals and we call them patients in some cases, as I've heard this week. But let's start really thinking deeply. Who are the users? Who are the end users? Are the end users of mammals, for example, in the sea, everyday citizens, or people who watch whales, or people on boats who go to watch whales and have a tourism industry business from it? Is it people who care for the number of whales in the world, and who are they? And many times people don't know about them. So I want the stakeholders to have a name. I also want you to fill out the mural framework to say, well, should I keep monitoring this person, this stakeholder type? Should I actively engage with them? And are they like my partners? And the word partnerships and partners has come up several times this morning when I was reviewing things. The United Nations often describe people as partners, especially with respect to the Sustainable Development Goals. Mission Publics, we are the internet, or we the internet, also talk about partnerships. But who are your true partners? And again, you get to fill this out. Who should you just monitor and make sure they're not doing anything shifty? Who should you observe and doing other things? And so that quadrant in the mural framework really helps you out. Now, after the interview is complete, you've got a transcription if you're doing this on Zoom. If you're doing this on something else, you may need to actually type out word for word. And about 1 hour of transcription, or sorry, I should say 1 hour of recording, usually takes about 8 hours of transcription time. Literally start, stop with your mouse or with some other gadget. So it's not that easy, right? You could also try to record and then play back to Zoom, and the recording isn't that bad. You'll still have a lot of cleanup to do. But what do you do afterwards? What do you do with that data? Well, ideally, once you have the transcript, and we'll get to this in week 3, is that you're doing discovery. You're trying to create a pain chain chart. You're trying to figure out what were the main problems that the user identified, that the stakeholder identified. What did they want us to take away from that conversation? What were the reasons for those problems or the pains? And in your mind, perhaps what are the solutions? And so we then get to more the concept mapping in week 3, which don't worry about it right now. There are different ways to study and analyze transcripts, but because we're only doing one per project, we're not going to have a huge amount of success in getting a plethora and a literal replication of all the different sort of ideas that may come out from users. But it's all about listening. This phase is about listening. And if you're tempted to constantly interrupt the interviewee, just try not to. Because sometimes we do, and we lose nuggets, especially if they're on our train of thought. At the same time, you're going to have to rein in the end user when they're going off track. And that's also a skill, because often people don't want to interrupt. So how do you rein someone back into the whole point of the interview? So that's week 2, folks. I'm going to wish you the best of luck. Please don't be afraid to reach out to me and say, Kat, who do you think I should interview? I've got 4 or 5 people on my list. Can I do more than one? But don't be overwhelmed by the material. Biggest thing is we go through the process. And of course, The extra credit is to actually sit the city training by the end of the session on the 3rd or 2nd of March, and that'll give you 5% extra. And then also the IRB application. And if you do go through it this time, what it means you don't have to go through it during the applied project. So I hope you learn so much from this engagement that you say to me, Kat, I've got the applied project worked out. It's going to be an extension of what I did in co-designing the future. I really enjoyed it, and I'm going to do that, especially if you've got your IRB application approved. But you also might come back and say, it was a good test bed. I learnt a lot from my virtual team, but actually I want to change project, and this co-design thing I want to do more comprehensively for the applied project. Instead of maybe one key informant, I'd like to look at maybe 5, which is a huge undertaking for an applied project, but I'm really eager to see different types of outcomes, including things like videos. Come and talk to my public interest technology colloquium. I'll put you down as a superstar. You can come and present to the public your project in 20 to 30 minutes. Don't be shy. You can put it down as a citation on your resume. Invite your friends, invite your colleagues. If you've got an idea for a 2-hour colloquium, join the club. Let's do it together. Let's have a live colloquium where we talk about the issues with one another as a group. We can do anything. Just keep talking to me. And I know I'll go through these notes again in a more structured way with the 35 to 40 odd PowerPoints that I've prepared for week 2. So I hope you're enjoying the course so far. Send me a note on the community board on Canvas and tell me how things are looking for you. And if you haven't spoken to me yet, there's about 4 of you left. I'd love to have a one-on-one with where you see this semester going. Thanks, team. Bye.